Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking again to the always brilliant political scientist and author, Dr. Vijay Prashad, the director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. Vijay, welcome back.
Nice to be with you, Pascal. Great to see you. Yeah.
Great having you again. I wanted to pick your brain about your analysis of the situation in 2025. I mean, today is October 22nd, and we are seeing the build-up for war in Venezuela, where everybody's expecting a second round of war in Iran. And we've seen, however, in this year, how BRICS developed, and also in the SCO and in other formats. So I wanted to know how you're making sense of what we're seeing currently in global politics.
Well, let's go with your phrase about war, because it's really interesting. The United States, one of the by far largest spender on the military in the whole world, more than 50% of global military spending. The NATO plus countries, if you include Japan, the Republic of Korea, and so on, close to 80% of global military spending. It's unbelievable, when you put it together, when you put the per capita numbers together of how much is spent in these societies. Nonetheless, in the past decade, the United States has not really been able to capitalize on its ability to destroy countries. So, for instance, about 20 odd years ago, it was, generally we watched the United States flounder in Afghanistan. Yes, fine. Joint Chiefs, you can bomb anywhere and you can destroy any hutment of the very poor Afghan peasants. But for God's sake, you don't know how to conquer the land. And that was very clear from pretty early on. Similarly, in Iraq, the United States could bomb Fallujah and bomb Ramadi and drop depleted uranium on those cities, but really couldn't hold them, couldn't occupy them effectively. And by the way, we're seeing the same thing with the Israelis. They can bomb Gaza from one end to the other, devastate the landscape. But, once the Israeli tanks entered into Gaza and the resistance started firing back, they had to withdraw. That was in 2024 January, they had to withdraw. They couldn't go into phase two of their occupation. And now they're sitting at the edges of Gaza, a lot of land that they've held, but it's not in Gaza City, it's not in Rafah, it's not in Khan Yunis. They've had to withdraw from that. They're too scared to lose lives. That's the fact of it. So, yes, the United States threatening Venezuela, but with what? 150 to 200,000 Venezuelans under arms. If the US actually landed troops in Venezuela, it would not be as easy as they imagine. They'd have to fight street by street. I don't think they're looking forward to that. I think at most a bombing here and there would be acceptable to the Joint Chiefs, but I don't think they're going to actually go to a full-scale war. We saw the same in Iran. Iran has 3 times the population of Iraq. Yes, you can bomb from the skies. The Israelis, they're such brave people. In fact, theirs is a war of cowardice, bombing from the skies. But they're not going to land troops on Iranian soil. I doubt it. They'll again face street by street fighting. They don't have the appetite for it. So the United States, their Israeli partners, the Europeans and all, lots of big talk, cowards way of fighting from the sky. But when it comes to really trying to take land, I don't think they have it in them. And by the way, if we think that they are going to pause before an attack on Venezuela, you can imagine the paper tiger, to quote Chairman Mao, on China. I mean, there is no way the United States is going to put even one soldier on Chinese soil.
At the same time, though, like we are seeing this escalation of rhetoric, right? And we see how the US now renamed its Department of Defense to Department of War and nonsense like that, while all at the same time, Donald Trump is trying to brand himself as the greatest peacemaker on God's green earth. But we also see how the understanding of peace is like a situation in which one side stops shooting, at least for Gaza, and the other side still keeps killing indiscriminately. And for some reason, Western media is absolutely fine with this and going along with it. We see it with Venezuela. I mean, the Western media just reports, oh, drug boats being taken out. Are you by in any way surprised by this public, like the propaganda machine around all of these horrible, like bloodthirsty acts?
Oh no, I mean the media has fallen into its own kind of sewer a very long time ago. I mean, we watched this in 2002 during the lead up to the illegal war against the Iraqi people. You know, when the New York Times, the so-called newspaper of record, effectively printed lies that were being fed to Judith Miller by the U.S. Intelligence services as if it was fact. You know, she wrote about weapons of mass destruction as if it was factual. And you can even go further back, you know, go back to the first attack on Iraq in 1991, when there was a public relations outfit that was constructing stories for the US media regarding babies being thrown out of incubators and so on. Much of that fabricated in order to build up for the attack on Iraq in 1991. I mean, all of this without, after the fact, a sense of shame by the media. It creates a kind of callous. You know, there is a kind of callous on top of the media. They don't seem to care. I mean, they'll report anything and everything. I mean, look at the reporting on Xinjiang without any care for the basic factual record. They'd say anything. You know, some time ago, a reporter once told the New York Times that, you know, I can report anything on North Korea and you'll run it. I could say that, you know, the regime's favorite dish is whatever, dogs grilled or eaten live, and you'd run it as a factual story. It doesn't matter because verification, trying to find a second or third source, none of that has ever stopped anybody from reporting whatever they want about the wars of the United States. So, you know, when you talk about, well, the media doing this or the media doing that, I mean, we need to be very clear that these are stenographers of power. These are not journalists. I refuse to accept them as journalists.
I absolutely agree. Yet I do think we are seeing currently a change in this. I mean, the sheer fact that we have social media, the fact that we have these podcasts and so on, and also direct reporting via Facebook and whatnot, even from a genocide zone, seems to me to do something. Maybe not so much in the West, but definitely in the global South. Do you have any observation of, like, if you compare the current period with this 2002, 2003 Iraq war, Afghanistan war, how is it different in the way that the global South now perceives these crimes?
Well, it's actually even in the global north. I mean, that's what provokes these big demonstrations. 250,000 people in Amsterdam, for God's sake. I mean, of all cities, you know, where there's a far right government, and you have this huge demonstration against the genocide in Gaza. You know, people just don't believe what they are reading in the mainstream or listening, or in fact, they don't read the papers. They don't, at one time we used to bemoan the fact and say, well, people aren't reading the news. It's not true. They're just not reading the garbage news. You know, they are getting their news in different places, websites, you know, podcasts like yours and so on, getting more and more popular, people willing to engage with other kinds of reporting, people who have contacts on the ground or who are on the ground reporting in a different way. You know, a long time ago, Patrick Coburn said that the best war reporting doesn't come from the front line. It comes from those who are able to assess what's happening. Because sometimes in the fog of the front line, you don't get the full picture. But in fact, that's proven a little untrue in Gaza, where it is very useful to have the voices of Palestinians reporting directly, telling us directly that what they are seeing is in complete conflict with what let's say the New York Times is reporting and so on. So yeah, it's made a big difference. I quite agree. I wouldn't deny that it's made an enormous difference. But I also will say that there is a kind of schizophrenia that we have. On the one know that the United States, for instance, is deeply weakened even militarily. Its ability to drive history forward with military power is weakened. We know that. On the other side, we fear the US because it has such immense capacity. I mean, okay, maybe the United States can't drive history forward in Venezuela with an invasion, but 4 or 5 mother of all bombs dropped on Caracas would certainly have an enormous impact on the Venezuelan people, on the people of Caracas. So that's the schizophrenia. We know they can't drive history forward with military force, but we know that they can really create havoc and destroy people's lives with their military force.
Yeah, I mean, they it's a little bit like seeing a very big, very confused, very angry man in the street with a lot of weapons. Is like even if you know that the guy is kind of confused, you wouldn't really want to get close, right? But we cannot get further away from the United States. The question, therefore, to me is how to maybe not disarm, but how to calm him down. Do you have any? Do you have any hope for us, our global ability to calm down the United States and tell them, look, it's going to be fine. It's going to be a multipolar world, but you'll still be an appreciated member of it. Did you see any way to do that? Do you see like the approach also of the Russians and the Chinese? Because I'm pretty sure they must be thinking about this.
Well, first, I would like people within the United States to come to a certain recognition. I think it's an important recognition. Look, you fought a 20-year war, spent over trillion US dollars to overthrow the Taliban. At the end of the day, the Taliban comes back. The Israelis conducted a genocide in Gaza, killed I don't know how many people, destroyed the entire infrastructure, partly to destroy Hamas. But Hamas is back. I mean, Hamas is not going anywhere. The Taliban are not going anywhere. The United States might be able to look back at its earlier examples of regime change. Maybe the overthrow of Saddam Hussein and so on. But those were conventional governments that were overthrown. These more like sort of political forces on the ground with mass sentiment behind them can't so easily be set aside. In other words, your strategy is useless. And so you might as well come to terms with reality. I mean, there is no way that the United States, with one military push, another military push, is going to get rid of the Communist Party of China. It's not possible. It's not going to happen. The Communist Party of China is enormously popular in China for many reasons. One of them is that it had been able to solve the problem of the pandemic. It has been able to get rid of absolute poverty. There has been stability in the country after the atrocious period before the Chinese Revolution, a long period of warlordism that perhaps goes back to the Qing dynasty all the way out to 1949, not even till the Japanese War, but even further back, before 1911. And people are like, oh my God, we know that history. We don't want to return to it. So there's got to be a way for let's say, reality to seep in that, look, in some parts of the world, you're just not going to be able to use your military and economic force to change the balance such that you prevail and your cutout comes to power. Even in Iraq, got rid of Saddam Hussein, but where's Ahmed Chalabi? He never became the prime minister or president of Iraq. He was their cutout. He was their favored character. He is nowhere to be seen. In Syria, I mean, I don't think the United States' first choice post Bashar al-Assad, I don't think their first choice was Ahmad Sharra, former Al-Qaeda. I think they would have preferred, perhaps one of the Muslim Brotherhood characters that the Turkish government was pushing forward. Or maybe, some European-backed fellow who would be brought from the University of Geneva or somewhere to become the president of Syria. But I don't think they really wanted Ahmad Shara, I very much doubt that even the Israelis were happy with this Al Qaeda guy because it looks bad. It just looks bad. Even if they're happy with him as a person, it just looks bad. So somehow reality has to seep in to the generations emerging in the United States that, guys, you just don't have it. You don't have the ability to transform the world with your bang, bang, bang. Even the cowboy movies don't always end, the way you imagine them. There's a lot of pathos at the end of the cowboy movie. The wrong guy dies sometimes.
Uh, the YouTuber and podcaster, I think Russell Brand, he once made a very, very witty comment, and unfortunately I can't find it anymore. But he once said, these people who are running the White House, are they really in charge, or are they just the fleas in the fur of the dog of war? The dog of war is what guides, it's a system that just relentlessly, because it was built over 250 years on extreme violence to get its way, right? I mean, it's built on a genocide in the North American continent. It is built on continuous expansion, 250 years of that. It's very much like Israel, right? Israel's in its DNA is the terrorism of the IDF, which goes all the way back to even pre 1948. So in a sense, like, it makes sense that these are expansionary and highly violent states then, because their institutions work like that. So do you think that even if that realization seeps in the majority of the people, isn't there a chance that unfortunately the system is just such, including capitalism and the way that capitalism works and incentivizes structures, that it just ends up being violent?
Well, at some point, a couple of things are going to strike a country like the United States. One is that it is a country with a very large number of migrants, and these migrants come from a range of countries, predominantly from Latin America and so on. And there is going to be a shift in the tonality or the culture of the elite. I mean, I'm not sure if Russell Brand's comment, it's a little convoluted because in a sense it's you could even stay with the old one of the tail wagging the dog or the dog wagging the tail. You don't have to get to the little bug sitting on the hair of the blah blah. I mean, the issue is we're talking about who controls things.
Mhm.
And and I'm not one generally disposed to the view that power is so centralized in some sort of conspiracy. I think a culture lays hold of a country as well, and transforming the culture has an impact. That it is actually true that mass cultural formations can have an impact on policy. And I don't mean this from a liberal point of view. I mean this from the point of view of if you have a narrow group of people running things, they also have to live in a world. They don't live in a castle somewhere in the sky. They live in the world, and they have to be impacted by that. Their next generation is impacted by that, and so on. So I think that there is a possibility of a cultural shift in these countries. This is not exactly the question of, the empire goes from Britain to the United States and so on. If Britain had for 20 more years been the center of the empire with the mass migration from the former colonies into Britain, Britain itself has changed quite dramatically. It's changed dramatically, and it's still struggling to change, with this strange, peculiar anxiety about migration. When it's a country that has been completely shaped by migration, it's that form of schizophrenia of old colonial powers that are in decline. That they have this schizophrenia of how they see themselves and how then they really are. I think that cultural thing takes time, but it'll settle. The other one is the practicality of it. I mean, you can have as small a number of people, the flea on the back of the XYZ. Yeah, you can have as small a number of people running things. They can have as paranoid and crazy a set of ideas as they want, but they are not effective anymore. There was a time when the United States had a much easier run overthrowing governments. The CIA could go in and they could operate in a much easier way to overthrow a government. It is harder now. It is harder. I mean, people have learned some lessons. In Venezuela, for instance, the fact that both in Venezuela and Cuba, the immense lessons of mass mobilizations, the Cubans learned this, the lesson of mass mobilization, they learned it decades ago. The Venezuelans have learned that lesson from Cuba. Other countries have learned it as well. I think Iran has learned this lesson. Mass mobilizations, get out tens of thousands of people onto the street, to block the politics of negativity in your country. We're seeing this in so many countries. The Chinese have utilized this during the pandemic, mass mobilization to get rid of poverty. This actually has prevented small numbers of people from conducting coup d'etats and so on. This idea of the color revolution has never appealed to me, largely because it is actually not so easy to control in many of these countries. Take the case of Nepal or Bangladesh or whatever it is. Sure, the Western intelligence services play a role, but as much a role as the failure of the governments that were there, and as great a role as the failure of these governments to deal with populations that whose median age is 25. In Malawi, the median age is 18, Pascal. That means half the population is under the age of 18. You don't need a color revolution to create a problem there. You've got people who just don't have jobs, don't want to migrate and work in some garbage job elsewhere. So that means that internal political forces need to really come to terms with these massive changes in their country and not hide behind the skirts saying, the West is harassing us, or they are coming in and doing the West is not as powerful as it used to be. It's a lot like the Wizard of Oz.
Right. At the same time, though, we do see how Western institutions try to meddle and influence. Right. I mean, we've now this beautiful comparison between Georgia on the one hand and Moldova on the other. And Europe got very, very mad, and the US got very, very mad for Georgia actually pushing through a transparency law saying if you're an NGO in this country and you receive more than 25% of your revenue from abroad, then you've got to declare that. You've got to make it clear so that we can have a look at who's trying to fund who, right? So, and we know that they got extremely mad and said, like, you need to stop this. It's not right to have transparency. Whereas in Moldova, we see how the current government is like very, very happy and obedient, and gets also like very much cheered on. We see the same in Armenia, which had even a political crackdown against any kind of opposition forces that are not in line with the pro-EU course. And all of this is framed as being pro-Russian or anti-Russian, when the Georgians say like, no, we just want to be neutral. We just don't want to piss off the Russians, right? So, what are good policies in order to make sure that, okay, on the one hand, grievances can be addressed, on the other hand, there is some meddling from the outside, isn't there?
Well, of course there is. I mean, look, these laws are fine. It's perfectly acceptable for a country to say that any funds anywhere should be transparent. But, that's also the goose and the gander. I mean, sometimes these are very small organizations that are getting harassed because they want to raise issues that are uncomfortable in the country. Whether they are talking about sexuality or whatever. These are being targeted. I mean, I would like to see all politicians be transparent. Why not? I mean, in some of the countries you mentioned, the transparency goes in only in one direction. The big politicians aren't transparent about their money, and occasionally one gets whiffs of scandals here and there. Also, these are relatively small countries that you're mentioning. I'm talking about in population and area, where small amounts of external funding can have an enormous out of size impact. It's not the same in a larger country. Country like India, where the Indian government has cracked down on Greenpeace and so on. I mean, I think there was an exaggeration by the government. I mean, what are you afraid of? They cracked down on a website that I had helped found, NewsClick, calling it foreign funded, this, that, arrested the founder, 75 years old, put him in jail for 8 months, because the website was reporting on the farmers movement, saying that, oh, it's foreign funded by the Chinese, funded by the, what are you afraid of? There's an outsized way in which these debates are also happening. I mean, I'm cautious about these debates. I get listen, I wrote a book called Washington Bullets. I'm not naive about the way in which Washington enters societies and tries to manipulate things and so on, or how private internet companies play with the algorithms. All these things are true. But also equally true is that there are real social forces that are acting in these countries and should not be immediately dismissed as the playthings of foreign countries. We have to have a much more broad and generous attitude towards contradictions, in a sense. Have actually a factual interpretation and not just put a theory in a blanket way. Just cover the whole of reality with a blanket and pretend that our blanket explains everything, when the nuances and the importance of a careful analysis, what Lenin called the concrete analysis of the concrete condition. If you're not doing that, you might miss a lot in specific contexts and countries.
Yeah, and also the acceptance that two things can be true at the same time. I mean, you can have influence operations from abroad and NGOs that do valuable work and a crackdown from the government against anything it just doesn't really want to hear. I mean, all of this. So it doesn't need to be either or. But
Absolutely. Absolutely. I really appreciate you saying that, because sometimes we fall into the box of
yeah.
of absolutism, which is not. I mean, I come from a Marxist tradition where dialectics is much more important than some sort of Kantian absolutism. So I very much agree and appreciate what you said.
I mean, I don't. This is one of the things that I don't understand with a lot of the European approach. I mean, why is it not possible that, the war in Ukraine was an illegal invasion and provoked? Why does it have to be either or? Why? But I still don't have a clear answer other than that the Europeans kind of think in those terms in Manichaean worldviews.
I mean, it could very well be, but I'm sorry, I'm going to get on a little tear, Pascal. But when you say Europeans think, and I don't want to be insulting to the continent of Europe because that's ludicrous, but I really have been very disappointed in the recent period with European intellectuals. I mean, professional intellectuals. I know that a vast number of them afraid of tenure, afraid of their permanency, whatever the policies in their different countries, they look forward to their careers and so on. Many of them are basically professionals, without being a moral compass driving them. I know that that's always been the case, and it's the case now. But where is the Jean-Paul Sartre in France today? Where is that person? Just that singularity. The Bertrand Russell in the UK. I just don't see that person. In Germany, it was horrifying to see that Jürgen Habermas had signed a text that effectively supported the Israeli genocide. I mean, this is the final person in the Frankfurt School. Beyond Habermas, I think the Frankfurt School is dead. The Frankfurt School starts with a critique of fascism and capitalism and ends supporting a genocide. That's pretty sad.
No, I absolutely agree. And there are good people. Luckily, Emmanuel Todt is somebody who speaks his mind and actually has useful analysis. Ulrike Gero in Germany, but they're also being sidelined, marginalized. Ulrike Gero lost her job at the University of Bonn because of like bad citations in a 2016 book. This kind of stuff is happening, and it does have this impact on people. But I absolutely agree. I mean, the spinelessness of Europe at the moment in politics and also academia and journalism is quite astounding.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not. I don't want to dance on the grave of European philosophy. I don't want to do that.
It deserves
But
to be
but
danced
it's
on.
this is just yeah. But this is just a reality. When Napoleon was marching on Jena, Hegel gave a series of lectures and praised Napoleon and said, this is the light of history and so on. At least there, Hegel was attempting to unite his philosophy with the facts of reality. Today, so many academics are just locking their office doors and pretending that Gaza is not happening, and that's worse than Hegel saying that Napoleon is the great savior of humanity. I would prefer Hegel to any contemporary scholar who locks their door.
So what would you recommend, or what's your gut feeling? What is the best way at the moment to also intellectually understand what's going on around us? I mean, this problem of sense making seems to be like very imminent again. I mean, with that you have these narratives that are going around, and you have people who try to impose narrative dominance, as in the Israeli propaganda machine on Twitter and so on, that just shells out time and time again that the Jews are being persecuted and the Hamas must be bombed, and there's no fault, no blame to be found, and stuff like that, and it's just massive. But all of this gives us like also the confusion of terms of things like Judaism and Zionism that people try to conflate in order to rob the our ability to make sense of things. What is the lens that you recommend to look at stuff?
Well, I mean, I'm an enormous believer in that line I quoted earlier, which is a concrete analysis of the concrete condition. And what a Marxist does is look at the whole. I'm interested in the whole, so I don't want to suppress a part of things. I'm interested in the economics, in the social side, in the cultural side. I mean, for instance, let's take the case of the conflict in Ukraine. Some of this is cultural. Some of this is this idea that the Slavs are vicious and brutal, and Europeans have to be protected from the Slavs. I mean, this goes back to an old, early modern, idea. I mean, there was a great book written years ago called Inventing Eastern Europe, which made the argument that Eastern Europe was treated as this lesser form of savagery. The great Mongol horde invading Western civilization. Yeah. There's a cultural side to this. There's definitely a social side to this self view of Europeans, that they are somehow liberal and have transformed themselves into people who accept and tolerate all forms of sexuality, all forms of let's say of social life, whereas the barbarians in the east are anti-gay. The irony, of course, is that anti-immigrant sentiment in Western Europe is at an all-time high. Perhaps they're not that tolerant, I'm sorry to say, but that's a self kind of a perception, social self-perception of people thinking, well, we are superior to these other people, to Muslims who are anti-gay. This becomes a significant trope. So if you don't have the Marxist understanding of the totality, if you don't look at all aspects, you might miss a lot. This is not just a military conflict. This is a social conflict, a cultural conflict. This is a conflict about economics. But then again, when you look at it merely economically, it's completely befuddling. Why is Europe cutting its feet off in order to walk? I mean, you've watched from 2003 onwards, Europe basically cut itself off from its main sources of energy. Iraq, 2003, Iran, 2006, Libya, 2011, and then in a train wreck, Russia from 2014 onwards. Yeah. So you've done this and then said, okay, we'll buy our energy from the United States, much more expensive. So if you just look at this economically, makes no sense. That's why you need the totality. You need to have a Marxist understanding of the totality, look at all the different aspects, judge them, look at this diplomatically, strategically, and militarily. I mean, Europe has trapped itself in a self-image of NATO, that somehow they are they are able to govern the world through NATO. That U.S. military power provides them with the opportunity to walk around, in Asia, saying we are still the masters of the universe because we are in NATO. I mean, for God's sake, what are you talking about? The Netherlands pretending to be a world power. You're not a world power, guys. You used to savagely, hold Indonesia and Suriname and so on, but you're not a world power any longer. You're a small country. Amsterdam is your major city. Rotterdam is a major port, but you're a minor, country at the edge of Eurasia. But NATO somehow gives them this overblown sense of themselves. Mark Rutte, former Netherlands prime minister, now the head of NATO. You see, you got to have a broader perspective on things. You got to look at things in a much greater way. You want to understand the role of China today. You got to understand the century of humiliation from the first Opium War in 1949. Chinese don't want to return to that. There's a great sense of optimism in China that they are not going to go back to that. So that's not economics. That's also culture. It's also society. It's also politics and so on. I'm a great believer in the Marxist optic of totality. I know it was pushed off the shelves by postmodernism, but too bad.
No, but it's also good advice, right? When as soon as somebody tries to bog you down in small little details, as in, so do you support Hamas? You need to go to the bigger picture in order to counter such stuff. But the question to me is whether the Europeans have the and if I say Europeans, I mean the social systems of Europe, whether they have the capacity to work themselves out of this very narrow-minded, single-minded kind of picture of the world, or if they're going to be stuck in fantasy land until fantasy land comes crushing down on them. Because we are seeing now that they're not able to produce weapons, they're not able to produce stuff, they don't have enough energy. This is going to come down. Or how do you see it?
Yeah, I mean, look, frankly, it's already coming down. The contradictions are already playing themselves out. As I said, the energy costs for Europe are going up. Europe's decision to yoke itself to every US conflict has had already immense negative impacts. You've got a Dutch chip manufacturer, Nexperia. It's having a difficult time supplying chips to BMW. BMW's factory lines have had to pause. This is serious economic impact for Europe. I mean, this economic impact isn't driven economically. It's the train wreck of having a bad political decision and strategic decision that's had a knock-on effect on the economy. So will this have an impact at the polls? Will a political force arrive and say, wait a minute, if we want BMW to stay in business, and by the way, bosses of BMW, you might want to pay attention. If you want BMW to stay in business, maybe we should break with the US and go our own way and create our own German or European strategic assessment of the world. Foreign policy was Libya a real threat to Europe in 2011? I don't think so. I think Sarkozy was trying to cover up something that he's now going to jail for, which is that Gaddafi paid for his presidential campaign. I mean, what a reason to destroy a country. That should be. I'm sorry, I'm not much of a death penalty person, but that's death penalty like. The price paid by Libya for Sarkozy's own venality is extraordinary. But is Iran a threat to Europe? Or was Iran providing energy to Europe? Is Russia really? I mean, does Russia really want to roll its tanks into I don't know, into Geneva? I don't think so. I'm not sure that the Russians care. I don't even think they want to roll their tanks into Kiev, to be honest with you. I'm not sure that that's even interesting to them. They have a lot of land. They don't have a land problem. I don't think that's interesting to them. So maybe a European assessment of its own place in the world is important. And I'm a political force now saying that. And then BMW says, oh, wait a minute, we should fund these people because this is better for BMW. Maybe but then here's the problem is the people who run BMW have their own personal wealth in BlackRock and not in the German DAX. And because it's in BlackRock, they have thrown their personal lot in with the United States. So that creates its multiple contradictions. They are more interested in their own personal wealth rather than in BMW. Tomorrow they leave the leadership of BMW and become heads of Ford. They don't really care. BMW is not a patriotic company. They don't care if jobs go in Germany. They're not interested in all that. That realization needs to be brought to the German people by a German political force. And right now, there's no political force. I'll be quite blunt with you.
Yeah.
That's putting this on the line.
Yeah. The left in Europe is pretty dead, isn't it? And just one thing for the record, the last time the Russians came to Switzerland, they came to help us against the French who occupied us for 15 years. Just for the record. But let's put that aside. Isn't the left, I think the left is dead, and I'm a paying member of the Social Democrats of the Swiss Social Democratic Party, but I am pretty much ashamed of the party line that the party currently has.
Well, I mean, there are elements of the European left that I feel pretty strong, that they are trying to develop something. The Workers' Party in Belgium, for instance, is extraordinary in its ability to have built a mass base, to have driven a progressive politics regarding the genocide in Gaza. I think they are trying to move an agenda on the question of Russia. It's very complicated, but they're trying to move an agenda. I think that in Germany, my friend Savim Dagdelen, who belongs to Bundesrat Wagenknecht, is one of the clearest voices against NATO inside Germany. I think she is quite extraordinary. I think that in across Europe, I've been traveling a little bit in Europe. I see the edges of very young people joining the left movement, whether it's the earlier communist parties, young people joining these movements, trying to revitalize them. They have been sort of stuck in a kind of sense of futility. And I think this youth entry could revitalize them. I don't know. I mean, the Portuguese communists have always been a pretty vital and exciting force. I don't know. I mean, I think that no people, no society is without its contradictions and without its ability to revitalize itself from the left flank. We'll just have to wait and see, have to wait and see what happens to the left bloc in France. They have been sort of, the door has been closed on them by Emmanuel Macron, strikingly, he's not permitting them to take the prime ministership, even though they have the biggest bloc in parliament. Let's see where that goes. Let's see what Mélenchon does in France. I mean, he's been very strong on the genocide against the Palestinians. He's been very forthright on that issue. There are complexities and confusions when it comes to Russia, but that's a broader issue than the left, and I think they will also be driven to reality, at some point. Right now, many of the left forces are afraid of quote unquote breaking ranks on Russia because they're afraid that the people are not there with them. And I think that opens a door for the right to go in that direction. And why would you do that? The left should open a debate and discussion about, really, is this a Russia problem or is this a NATO problem?
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, demonizing the left makes no sense, and actually, a few of the things, especially Gaza, have actually brought back some of these humanitarian fundamentals as well. Vijay, this was like very interesting to hear how you're looking at things in the last quarter of 2025. People who want to read more from you, where should they go?
They should go to the Tricontinental. That's a great place to go, the tricontinental.org. And I want to say, Pascal, you're doing a terrific job with this platform because it's not just about current events, right? It's about how do people see things, and I think that's important for people to understand that intellectual activity is really important for everybody, including activists.
And we need to improve this somehow. I mean, only complaining about stuff is brings you so and so much like confidence, but then the other part is like rebuild a proper Europe, rebuild a proper future. So that's what's going through my mind. But the question is how. It's like humanity is like a history of building one Frankenstein after another. So it's like. All right.
But
Thank you.
we keep trying. We keep trying.
We keep
Yeah.
trying. That's true. Vijay Prashad, thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks a lot.